Okay, well, it's time to begin. Thank you all for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started in lesson number 4 on page 17 if you have a workbook. Welcome to Bible class. Happy Wednesday. We're going to continue our study of the Exodus. We are out of Egypt. We're officially out in the wilderness, and things still are going pretty poorly, but we have lots of lessons to learn from the Israelites and their plight in the wilderness. But before we get too far into things, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we are grateful to you for this opportunity to study your word. Thank you for the narrative of the Exodus. Thank you for recording these events for us so that we can learn from them. We do not want to serve any other God. We know there is no other God. We don't want to be stiff-necked. We want to follow you and humble ourselves before you. Help us to do that. Help us to leave the life you saved us from behind us. Please help us to live for you and walk in newness of life as you would have us to. Please help us to learn all the lessons that we can from this time together and from each other and from your word, not just now, but every day. And it's in your son's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so the first, if you just kind of look back at the lessons that we've been through, we talked about the call of Moses, we talked about the plagues and the Passover. We kind of divided that up between a couple of weeks. We talked about the journey to Sinai, and then tonight we're going to be talking about trouble at Sinai. We mentioned in our first class, or maybe our second class, maybe both, but we talked about the importance of Sinai. We've seen Sinai before. Where have we seen Sinai before? The burning bush, right. So Moses has been to Sinai before. He has been on this mountain before. Other than Sinai, what's another name that we find for Sinai? Horeb, okay. So we're back at Sinai. This time it's not just Moses and a burning bush. It's the entire group. It's everybody. It's the entire nation of Israel. And so we're back on the mountain, sometimes called the Mountain of God, Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. I'll just keep calling it Sinai because I feel like that's how most people know it. So, but there is going to be some trouble at Sinai. So if you look at this map, I mentioned last week, as we're thinking about the city of Ramses, here's Egypt. Obviously, this whole region is Egypt. That's still where Egypt is today. But then we have Succoth, Etham, Baal-Zephon. There's a few cities kind of west of the Red Sea that we talked about last week. But this exact map we're going to see over and over again. Some of these sites of these cities are unconfirmed, but this is pretty much the route that they took. The Sinai Peninsula is not that big. And so one of the things, if you look at the fast facts actually on page 17, 11 days towards the bottom right above Kibroth Hattaavah, 11 days is the amount of time it should have taken to get from Sinai/Horeb to Kadesh Barnea, and it's going to take Israel 40 years. So if you look at here, at the bottom we have Mount Sinai. This is where Mount Sinai is going to be. And so you think about it's only been a few months. It hasn't been that long for them to get from Ramses to Sinai, and yet for them to get from here to here is going to take 40 years. Obviously, that is divine. It's not just it took them that long to walk. There's going to be major issues. They're going to end up wandering for a long time. But just so you can kind of see where they started and where they are and where they're going, in a sense, they're halfway there. And yet, they're only a few months in, and the rest of this journey and the rest of this class is going to take them decades because of the things that are going to happen. So we've talked already about manna. We're told in a couple different places it looks like coriander seed. We're also told it looks like bdellium. If you're anything like me, I've heard of coriander. I don't know that I had heard of bdellium, but I didn't know what either of those things looked like, and so here it is. This top left picture, this is just extra bonus information. This is taken from a New York Times article that apparently there's a restaurant in New York City that is serving manna. I don't know how they have a recipe for that, but they made up a dish and they're calling it manna, and it looks like that. So anyway, that's just kind of interesting, but it is kind of, I mean, if you look at Bdellium and you look at these different things, that is kind of maybe what it looks like. But anyway, just so you can, I'm a very visual person, that's why I put pictures in the PowerPoint, so hopefully that's helpful. But those are some of the things we have going for us, and that's kind of where we are. So they're already stopped in a few cities before they get to Sinai, and so a few months are going to pass. So we're going to kind of jump around in the timeline a little bit. I failed to mention this to this point, but obviously we're covering a span of about 40 years, but we're covering several books of the Bible over the course of this class. And if you look at things that are specifically mentioned throughout that 40 years, much like sometimes when we talk about the life of Jesus, for example, we have information about his birth, we have the one story from when he's 12, and then we have a lot of detail about the last 3 years of his life, specifically the last week of his life, specifically the last 12 hours or so of his life, right? So the wandering in the wilderness is kind of the same way in the sense that we have a few anecdotes, if you will, from the first couple years, and then some from the end. We're obviously going to get to the conquest, which Zach is going to take us through in our Joshua class. But this isn't just, it's not like it's a diary of what happened every day for 40 years. We don't have an equal amount of information that's going to cover the span of these 40 years. But as we get into tonight's lesson, I just have a few discussion points that I want to go over that's going to kind of cover what happens at Sinai. As we're thinking about getting into the wilderness, we've talked about the trouble that they already had. We talked in the introduction, we talked about them crying out to God because the slavery is so harsh and so severe and getting worse. And so God, and we talked last week about how the Exodus is pretty passive, right? That they don't have to do very much. God pretty much does all of the work for them. And so then they've been brought to this point. And now they're at Sinai, and then more is going to happen at Sinai. So the first thing I want to mention is just thinking about the mountain itself. If you would turn to Exodus chapter 19. In Exodus chapter 19, we get to Sinai. So this is just a few months after, if you read Exodus chapter 19 and verse 1, on the third new moon after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the day they came to the wilderness of Sinai, they set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. They encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain while Moses went up to God. The Lord called him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, tell the house of Israel." And so Moses and God have these interactions on the mountain when they get to Mount Sinai. But famously, Mount Sinai is a very intimidating place to be. So how would you answer that question? What was it like at Sinai? What's going on at Sinai? Specifically, if you look down at chapter 19, if you look pretty much verse 16 down, they get to the Sinai, they get to Sinai, they get to the mountain, and what's going on? What do things look like? Scary, okay? What's scary about it? What'd she say? Thunder.
It looks ominous.
Ominous. Ominous is a good word. Right? What else? Oh, yes, JD.
Maybe the fact that since it's a mountain, it is thus naturally intimidating.
Right. So just the size. And mountains are large, right? Mountains are big, and so you can imagine looking up at a mountain and seeing it shake and seeing the storm and seeing all of these things. It's interesting how, and this is something that we're going to talk about over and over again in this class, is it's so easy to have this sense of awe when you're looking at God, right? Or when you're thinking about God and the things that he can do. When you're looking at a mountain shake and you're looking at the thunder and you're seeing the plagues and you're seeing all these things that are happening, that's incredible. And you can see there's power there. There's very obvious, very big power there, right? And yet the Israelites are going to kind of have this waffling back and forth between, well, we want God's power, but we want it over there. Or we want God's power, we want God to be on our side, but we want God to be on our terms. We're glad he's powerful, we're glad he's brought us this far, but Moses, you talk to him. And so we're going to kind of see this continued idea of God displays his power, God shows his power through the plagues, through the mountain shaking and all of these things that are happening, and yet the people of Israel, they like it until they don't like it, and then they're scared, and then so there's just kind of this going back and forth. Anything else about the mountain itself? Let's go ahead and read a little bit more in verse 9 of chapter 19. And the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, and the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever." When Moses told the words of the Lord, told the words of the people to the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments and be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. And you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, 'Take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot. Whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain.' So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments and said to the people, 'Be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman.'" So imagine you're an Israelite, and you've been enslaved for hundreds of years, generations upon generations. And then you cry out to God, and you've been complaining about what Egypt is like and how harsh the Pharaoh is, and you have no one to lead you, and you have no hope of getting out. And then Moses and Aaron take charge, or they're put in charge, and you're led out. You cross a sea on dry land, right? You see the waters split. You see all the 10 plagues. You saw a divide between light and darkness that would have been incredible. You see all these masses of animals, locusts and gnats and all the plagues, all these incredible things. And then as soon as you get into the wilderness, you're hungry, you're thirsty, your feet hurt, and you're kind of wondering, what are we doing here? What's next for us? But then you keep going, and then you get to Sinai, and remember, what have we said? We've mentioned a couple times. Think back to class number 1, class number 2. When God talked to Moses and told Moses to tell Pharaoh the reason for them going into the wilderness, what was the reason God gave for wanting his people out of Egypt? Other than just rescuing them. To worship him, right? And so now worshiping God is being in his presence. It's serving God for who he is, telling God what you think of him, and acknowledging who God is. Now they're seeing who God is. They had already seen who God is. They had already seen these signs and these plagues, and yet now they see it here. What are you thinking? Having been through, again, you're an Israelite, you've seen all these things, and yet now the mountain is kind of blocked off. You're told that if an animal or a person goes near the mountain when they're not supposed to, you'll be shot. What are you thinking, Ben?
Well, first thing I think about is fear. There's obviously intimidation, hopefully reverence, but there's clearly a distinction God is trying to make. And Deuteronomy 4:11, you mentioned darkness and cloud, and it also says a thick gloom, and they hear a voice, but there's no form. So he's speaking out of the midst of the fire. So all of that's pretty intimidating when you are being told to prepare yourself and you're going to get these instructions.
Right. Anything else? Richard?
Yeah, so this is the first time they had been actually in the presence of God. Up to this point, they dealt with Moses.
Right.
Deal with Moses here. But you could just put yourself in their position. entire mountain tremble.
Right.
And the thunder, the lightning, and the smoke, and they're about to hear God's voice. And that's going to be fearful too.
I know, and yeah, the sights, the sounds, all of it just would have been incredible. Was there a hand over here? Stu? Yeah.
It seems later on in the chapter there's a great deal of curiosity. They haven't seen the face of God. This is happening. And he said, hey, be careful. They're going to want to look, and many of them are embarrassed. They want to see God. They want to know what's going on. They want to know who's responsible. And it's dangerous.
Exactly. Like Ben was saying about him not having God not really having a form. If you, as humans, if you hear a voice, the voice is coming from somewhere, right? And so it's almost like, oh wait, is he up there? Is he a person? Is he what does he look like? Hugh?
And they've got 3 days to think about it. And that usually creates a lot of issues when you have a lot of time to think about what if.
Right. Yeah, I thought that was one of those things. There were many things as I was studying and putting this material together that I hadn't realized before, and I hadn't realized that when they get to Sinai, they have 3 days to prepare. But you kind of think that you could kind of think about that a couple ways, where you could easily overthink it and think, like we've heard before from them. What are we doing? Why are we here? What is this? But also the point is to consecrate themselves, right? They're supposed to wash up, they're supposed to purify themselves, because it's almost like, obviously it's not like God travels in the same sense as we travel, he's beyond that, but it's almost like God's going to get here in 3 days, and so they have those 3 days to prepare. But I want to go back to, was there anyone else I overlooked? Oh, yes, Stephen.
I think this is an example of that humans desire to know the end of something, whenever maybe it's not for us to know the end of everything at all times. What they really were, I guess, expecting is, hey, you're going to tell us everything that's going to come out, instead of just trusting that, hey, I'm doing what God told me to do at this moment, and that's really all he has to reveal to me at that time. I don't need to know all the end of everything for me to follow God. And the same is really true for us. I need to know what he's told me here. I follow it to the degree I can, but I don't know every single thing that's going to happen the way it's laid out. Other than what he's told me, I haven't experienced it myself. So.
Right, and that's a really important point, kind of combining things a couple people have said. When you think about, sometimes we can have a hard time with the fact that we don't know more than we know. We're very curious creatures. We want to know the end of things. We want to know how things work, why things are the way they are. And yet in some ways, and in a lot of ways, that's just beyond us. God's way is far beyond our way. He's far above us. He's much bigger and smarter and everything better than we are, right? But I think that goes back to the concept of authority. When you think about, we live in a culture that's very, you can't withhold information from me, and you can't be above me, and everybody's equal, so I can just kind of be on par with you, and so that kind of leads to kind of this rejection of authority as a whole, where it's just, I don't have to listen to you, you can't tell me anything. And I think you kind of see that what a healthy relationship with authority looks like here. Not that the Israelites are doing everything right, but there's a fear there, right? It would be terrifying to see the things they saw and experience the things they experienced. And do they react well to that fear? No. But that I think there's something to be said for that healthy fear of, he is much bigger than me, he can shake mountains, there's this fire and this lightning and all these things, but still, in a perfect world, and that's kind of the whole human problem with sin, right, is we should see that power. They should have seen that power and said, okay, I want to be on his side, I want to follow him, I'm going to listen to him, but then obviously that doesn't happen. Ben?
Yeah, just hearing you talk about fear, that would be something really important for them. They're coming out of Egypt with all the different gods. There needs to be a really strong reverence and fear of I am God and there is no other. And that's going to be one of their biggest challenges in their entire history. So they have to be taught this from the very beginning. There's a clear distinction of who he is compared to all the other gods. And so I think that could be another reason why we're seeing what we are.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great point. Speaking of this idea of other gods and God in comparison to other fake deities, false deities that would have existed at the time, if you'll go back a chapter to Exodus chapter 18, and I want to read verses 7 through 12. This is when Jethro kind of enters. We've heard of him before. We've mentioned him before. But look at some things Jethro's saying. He's a priest of Midian, and there's kind of some debate. I was looking at some commentaries earlier today. There's some debate about whether Jethro was a priest of Jehovah God or whether he's like a pagan priest. Apparently, different commentators have different ideas on that. From what I was reading, and kind of the conclusion I came to was that he would have heard of, and what we're about to read is he had heard of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had heard of the God of the Israelites, and he was a Midianite. So this is like an extra credit question from Ben's class. Does anybody remember who the person Midian's mom and dad were? Father is an easy one. So Midian. If we go, what I'm driving at is if we go back a few generations, Midian's father is Abraham, and Midian was born by Abraham's wife Keturah. So that was mentioned a couple weeks ago in Ben's Bible class about the daily Bible reading. So I bring that up to say the Midianites were related to the nation of Israel, but it was just kind of a different branch of the Abrahamic lineage. Okay, so there would have been a connection there with the God of Abraham, right? They would have going back a few generations. Obviously, Isaac is the son of promise, and we've talked about that. And so the Israelites become the Israelites through a specific lineage, but because of Abraham and Keturah and their son Midian, if we go down a few generations, then we get to Jethro. So all that to say, it appears that they would have known of the God of Abraham, but it's not necessarily, they weren't God's chosen people, so it stands to reason that there would have been other deities that they had thought about or that they believed in. And really throughout history, something that we see with all these false deities and polytheism and things is that there's a lot of polytheists throughout history look at their gods and think, okay, I have these gods, I serve these gods, but your gods are okay too. And so if we go to war, it's your gods versus my gods, or my God versus your God. And so anyway, it's just interesting to think about what Jethro's, I guess, belief system might have been before we get to what we're about to read. But if you'll read with me in verse 7, Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, which is Jethro, and bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare and went to the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the good the Lord had done in Israel, in that he had delivered them out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because in this affair they dealt arrogantly with the people." And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So what I see here, and again, there's different perspectives on this, and I'd be curious to hear your opinions, but the conclusion, what I see happening here is it's almost like this is a conversion story, where Jethro has been a priest over in Midian. He's heard of Yahweh, right? He's heard of the things that Yahweh has done, and yet he's heard, and now specifically where he's at now, he's heard of these things that Yahweh had done through the Egyptians. And like we've talked about how through these plagues and through these signs, Yahweh has compelled Pharaoh with a mighty hand. We've talked about in the past few classes about the plagues, these different deities and these different gods that the plagues would have been direct attacks on, including Pharaoh himself. And so it's just kind of interesting to see, like now, he says, now I understand that the Lord, God, Yahweh, Jehovah, is better than all the other gods. I know that he's superior, and you kind of see him come to that conclusion here. But along that vein, what do you all make of Jethro? What do you think about him? What do you learn from this story, JD?
Well, not just from this perhaps potential conversion story here, but even later in this story about him in this chapter, I see him as a very wise man, personally, with much wisdom, not to spoil too much of the chapter if we're going to get there, but he's the one who actually basically tells Moses to share his burden, to even out the load, balance the scales by getting other people of the elders of these Hebrew people to assist him in leading the people, because it's too much for one man to do alone, taking care of an entire nation.
Right. Yeah. There's certainly a lot of wisdom in Jethro's advice that he gives, and his role as Moses' father-in-law, and just giving him this really paternal, really fatherly advice of, I can see this is too much for you. I can see you need to delegate some. You need some help. And so kind of seeing that connection that they have, but also him just stepping in and being helpful, but then also his views of, it's almost like you see an outsider's perspective of the Exodus. We know what happened we've talked about what happened to the Egyptians. We've talked about, and we're going to keep talking about what's happening to the Israelites and the Israelite view of the Exodus and the Egyptian view of the Exodus. But now we have this guy who's been in Midian the whole time, and we know that word has traveled fast of all the incredible things that Yahweh had done in Egypt. Joanna?
In the patriarchal period, I mean, it is possible that God had interactions with other patriarchs who were faithful. It's just that he chose the Abrahamic line, and that's the only details we're going to get. But we know he had other prophets outside of Israel, because Balaam was a prophet of God outside of Israel. So, Israel was God's chosen people, but very few of them were truly faithful to him. It's possible he had faithful people outside of Israel too.
Right, and there is something to be said for, how, I guess, directly God is interacting with his people. Obviously, with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, he's talking to them very directly. Here with Moses, Moses is this, mediator between the nation and God, and so we see a very direct line of communication. And but again, no matter how much interaction Midian, the nation of Midian, the Midianites had with Jehovah God, it is incredible to see kind of how the word had traveled. And just a few months in, when Jethro comes, he has heard of the Exodus. He knows that the Israelites are out of Egypt. He knows that like we've talked about in past classes, he knows that the land of Egypt is just absolutely in ruin. And they went from being one of the most powerful empires, and maybe the most powerful empire in the world, to basically ransacked overnight. And so it's just really incredible to think about that. Christy?
When I was reading through this, I was overwhelmed with how he said, he heard about what had happened, and he said, now I know the Lord is greater than all. That's what God did this for. That's what he kept saying. I'm doing this so people will know that I am the one who truly God. I just think, man, if Pharaoh would have just listened, so many things could have changed. But I just thought it was interesting that was the outcome that he came to, the conclusion he came to.
Right. You see that superiority. Again, not to say that there are other gods, but with the pagan mindset that would have been, when we go to battle or when we clash, right? When there's violence, it's my gods versus your gods. All of the Egyptian gods were fake, and Yahweh is not. And so then to see that power the natural conclusion in their mind is the good, healthy conclusion that God was going for, right, is Yahweh is superior. Yahweh is, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, right? And so you see Jethro's heart, and likely there were many people like Jethro that had the same reaction Jethro had outside of the Israelites and the Midianites and all of that. And so you just kind of think about the reactions that the world at large would have had hearing about everything that had happened in Egypt. Anything else before we move on? Any more comments about Jethro? Another thing I wanted to talk about was, we'll talk about more about this in a later class, but thinking about covenant relationships, there's a lot of words that we use as Christians, a lot of words that are in the Bible and are very important in the Bible that we maybe don't use in any other context. With covenants, we talk about the covenant of marriage, right? That's a context in which a lot of people talk about, a lot of people use the word covenant. But if you go back to the next chapter and Sinai, we see the covenant confirmed. We're actually going to have a later class where we're going to talk pretty extensively. We're going to spend two classes actually talking about the laws that are set up in Exodus through Deuteronomy. But what do we learn about a covenant relationship? In Exodus chapter 24, we see the covenant confirmed. If you'll look with me at Exodus chapter 24 and verses 7 and 8, it says, Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they all said, All the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. And then later in Exodus chapter 34, after the golden calf incident, in Exodus chapter 34, verses 10 through 28, we're not going to read those right now, but we see this covenant being renewed. So we see this idea of a covenant being confirmed, a covenant being confirmed with blood, which is obviously a major point of the Bible. But then also with the golden calf incident, we see this idea of a broken covenant and then the healing or the renewal of that covenant after that covenant has been broken. So what comments do you have on that idea of a covenant relationship, a covenant promise from the things we see in those chapters? Kyle?
Well, when we think about the covenant of marriage, we're thinking often about the promises that a husband and wife make to each other. Both are equals in the sense they're both human beings. They both make a commitment, and they both are on a sort of equal footing there. But there's also that covenant relationship that they made a covenant before God, who has authority. When we think about that aspect of it, the covenant we have with God, we're not co-equal with God. We're not the same. God is the authority. He gives the terms of the covenant, and that's why we see there in chapter 24, verse 7, all that the Lord has said we will do and be obedient. They're the created ones. Their obligation is to submit themselves. They have the choice not to, but really the covenant relationship is based on their submission to the authority, not just an agreement with someone else who is their equal.
Exactly. There's a decision to enter a covenant, right? But there's also a lot of daily decisions to maintain that covenant, right? A marriage isn't just as simple as saying I do once and then good. Your marriage is good. Everything's perfect, right? It's making those daily decisions to stay in that covenant. And while it's not the same dynamic, of course, I really like that point about this kind of horizontal covenant of like two equals, right? Two people on equal footing versus a covenant between us and God. God does not break covenants. God is the great promise keeper. But what he requires from his people is these daily decisions to maintain that covenant and to keep that covenant going and to keep that promise going. But he will always uphold his end of the bargain, right? And so when he promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob these promises that he makes, and when he says these things about you will be my people and I will bless all the nations of the earth through you, God's part of that won't be stopped because of God, right? If anything's going to get in the way of that, it's going to be us, right? Anything else about this idea of covenant? I know Ben has talked some about the covenants and these promises. Troy?
I know in my Bible in Exodus 15:13, and then it's a phrase that comes up time and time again, especially in the Psalms. It's like over 125 times, and it's steadfast love. But the note I have on Exodus 15:13 is God's covenant love. It is, if I'm reading this right, it's the Hebrew word hased. And it's that word that means not just God loves his people, but it's that covenant love that he has with his people. And David mentions it all throughout. You read steadfast love, especially in the ESV, all throughout the book of Psalms. And it started, I think, Genesis chapter 24, and then it just goes forward from there.
Right. I thank you for bringing that up. You know, that word hesed, there's a lot of conversation about what hesed means. It's kind of its own word, and a lot of times in different translations it'll be translated loving kindness. That's interesting that yours has that footnote about covenant love, but that's really, I think that's a great way. I'm not a Hebrew scholar by any means, of course, but I like that translation of covenant love, right? This loving kindness, this steadfast love, because it kind of drives home the point of, you know, this isn't just like, there's just a depth of God's love that really we can't even, I don't think there is a good translation for, or a good word for the love or covenant love or steadfast love. Words are just inadequate to describe just how steadfast and just how profound that love is. And so thinking about that as the premise of everything that God's doing here, it's not just look at these plagues I can do, or look at the power that I have. That's part of it, but it all comes from a place of steadfast love, hesed, loving kindness, covenant love, that we're going to continue to see despite the best efforts of the Israelites. A couple more things before, there's a couple incidents that happened that I want to get to before class is over. Number one is the golden calf incident in Exodus chapter 32. If you'll notice on your table of contents, there's a lesson later in the class called Rebellious Hearts. I think it's lesson number 8. And we're going to spend a whole class talking about these different stories of people who break laws and are rebellious. And so we kind of see that, we've seen that already with them complaining about water and complaining about food. And then we're going to talk about, in the last few minutes, we're going to talk about the golden calf incident and then the quail incident that you will have read for. And so with the golden calf incident, can someone give me like a 30-second Spark Notes version of what happens with the golden calf? JD?
They wanted God they could see more than able.
They perfect. They wanted a God they could, that was great. I preached a 45-minute sermon on the golden calf, and I could have just said that. But they wanted a God that they could see, and so they made one, right? They would have seen, I would imagine they would have seen idols in Egypt. We've talked about, I mentioned Hathor, one of the Egyptian gods, the goddess of sensuality, music, fertility, kind of a lot of different things. She was often depicted in the form of a cow. So I'm not going to die on the hill that there's a connection there, but it stands to reason that there could be. But who are the main players? Obviously, there's the nation of Israel. They want a calf. But as far as if we're going to look at this from the top down, what's going on with Moses and Aaron when these things are transpiring? Stephen?
Well, I mean, Moses is up on the mountain receiving the law, and it's as if the people disregard God's eternal nature, and they associate Moses being gone as if God is gone. You know, hey, Moses hasn't shown up for so long. We don't know what's happened to him. So it kind of takes a pretty great leap in my mind to immediately, okay, let's go ahead and make this idol. But that's what they do.
Right, how, like JD said, they wanted a God that they could see, and with Moses we have this direct line between God and them. That's the point. He's the mediator. He's literally in the process of getting the law, so that they can communicate with all of these things. And yet, as that conversation is happening, they think, well, it's been a little bit too long, and they just get bored or whatever it is, and it's just really incredible to see how, and I agree that seems like a really big leap to me. He's been gone for a few weeks, and so they decide to make this idol. Kyle?
Well, it stands out to me that in verse 9, God refers to the people's stiff neck when we think about the stubbornness of Pharaoh through the 10 plagues, and what an impact that should have had upon the children of Israel to see that stubbornness resulted in ultimately the destruction of Egypt and the destruction of Pharaoh and his entire army, and yet that's exactly the characteristic that God condemns them for.
Exactly. We talked a lot about hardness of heart, being stiff-necked, and that's a great point. I hadn't quite thought of it in that way, but if you had to list if you were a coroner and you had to list like a cause of death for Pharaoh, you could write stubbornness or hard-heartedness, right? And that's kind of what's happening to the people here too, right? Is we want this and we don't have it, and we want all these things, almost like trying to put God in a box or have God on your own terms. And so, obviously, if they should have learned that from Pharaoh, then let us learn that from them, right? That let's not die the same death. Let's not make the same mistakes that they did. Sean?
And as many have pointed out over all of our lifetimes, the golden calf, I see that as, you ever heard of a straw man's argument? You make something that is just so outlandish as a point, but I find it interesting because the base root cause is the same base root cause as why we sin. We forget that God is always there. And it's easy to point and laugh because it is a straw man. They go absolutely wild. Right? But how many times in my life have I looked at a situation, saw, and knew what the right decision was and still didn't do it, even though I knew God was watching?
Exactly. That's what I keep going back to, the verse that I put at the very end of the introduction. God saw the people of Israel and God knew. Exodus 2:25. God saw the people of Israel and God knew. We see that over and over again as we go throughout this story, the whole Exodus story. In the last couple minutes, will you turn with me to Numbers 11? We're going to talk about quail for a couple minutes. When we're looking at the people and they've complained about water, they've complained about food, they're given the manna. In Numbers 11, I kind of think of it as they keep moving the goalpost, right? They say, we want this from God, we want to get out of Egypt, we want water, we want food, we want all these different things, and yet they keep kind of changing what they're asking for, or we want something different, or we want more variety, or we wish we were back in Egypt, and they're just very just unstable in a lot of ways. But if we read in Numbers chapter 11 and verses 31 through 35, the Lord brought quail from the sea and let them fall beside the camp, a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on the other side, around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the ground, so 3 feet of quail. And the people rose all that day and all the next day, gathered the quail. And so they're gathering, but then in verse 33, while the meat was yet between their teeth, before it was consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck down the people with a very great plague. Therefore the name of the place was called Kibroth Hattaavah, because they buried the people who had the craving. Does anybody have a footnote about what Kibroth Hattaavah means? Graves of craving. I think that's one of the most... I've never been more excited to have a city translated. That is the most incredible name for a city. It's terrifying, but graves of craving. And I know we're out of time, and we'll talk more about this in the future, and we're going to see this over and over again. But what are we letting kill us because we crave it more than we crave God. I don't want God's power against me, right? I want God on my terms. I want what I want, but I also want what God can give me. What graves are we burying ourselves in because of our cravings that we won't let die? And I'll leave you with that.